And that was another thing that really, really drove me to talk about this. All you have to do is search this title in Twitter to see some comments that come up that are divisive. And I want to know who funded that study. Clearly some shady business going on.
Big Vegetable paid for it.
Yeah, and I get it. I get it. I get how. Actually, I don't get it, but.
This is Generation Health. Every week we bring you the latest in news, cutting-edge research, and time-tested best practices, helping you live a longer, healthier life. Sitting with me on this couch, Joey DiMatteo, PharmD, board-certified clinical nutritionist. How are you, sir?
Very good, thank you.
And to his left, my right in the middle, Dante DiMatteo, PharmD. What's up?
Not much.
I like that orange shirt.
Thanks.
It takes a special person to pull off an orange shirt. Tennessee approves.
Yeah, for sure.
And to my left, Josiah Schweinberg, our engineer, helping me lock it in, not lose it.
Rein
Trying
this
to
in.
refocus.
If you people only knew how unprofessional everyone here can be, it's a mess.
Just a bunch of guys being dudes.
It's
Yeah.
true. You put us in a room and
Dudes being bros.
it gets out of hand fast. All right. So my name is Tyler Andrews. I'll be your host, whether you want me to or not. And that leads us to the question that I've been dying to ask. What's the best sitcom ever?
I'm going to go with the kind of stock answer, but Seinfeld.
I was gonna say,
No.
Yeah. What's yours?
That's the
You didn't give me any
incorrect
time
opinion.
to think.
is it best ever or like in like
Yeah.
what you grew up on?
Yes.
All of the
You get to answer it however you
I
want.
would, yeah, then I would say I like Curb Your Enthusiasm.
From your
better than
critical
Seinfeld.
expertise.
That's right. Stay in your lane, Josiah.
I don't know, man.
You're not even qualified to answer. No one's qualified to answer this.
I've seen all of them. That's not true.
Big
After
Friends,
seeing them
big
all.
Friends guy.
Friends was probably my favorite.
Really?
Yeah.
Is Curb Your Enthusiasm a sitcom?
Yeah.
Technically, yeah.
I was gonna say Home Improvement. That's what I grew
Dude.
up.
Oh,
with.
yeah.
Home
I
Improvement.
love
was-
that.
Yeah.
Tim the Tool Man.
Tim the Toolman. I saw a
Al
photograph.
Borland.
I saw a photograph of, what was the neighbor's name? Wilson.
Wilson.
I saw a photograph of him in his costume on set, turned and facing the camera. And it really messed me up.
Not like how you imagined the lower part of his face.
Yeah, no-
It was like when
beard.
Kane. It
It
was
was
like
like no
when Kane was
Yeah.
unmasked.
Wrestling, right? Wrestling.
Well, we've made it a long ways.
And we're off and running here.
It's good. This episode actually is going to be fantastic because we've already recorded most of it. This is the slap happy toward the end as we're tired. But guys, it's good stuff. We are going to talk about a couple of different things today. We've got a new study showing a link between red meat consumption and poultry consumption and processed meat consumption and diabetes. And we've possibly got some conversation to have at the end. We'll see. But first, what's happening behind the counter? Spencer Matthews has been awarded a Guinness World Record for the most marathon distance runs on sand in 1 month. Pretty specific. But he ran 30 marathons in 30 days, all in the intense heat of the Jordanian desert. A marathon, just in case you're wondering, is 26.2 miles. He ran them every single day. According to my calculator, that means he ran 786 miles. That's nearly the entire length of his home country, the UK, except this was in the desert. In order to avoid the worst of the heat, Spencer got up at 2:30 a.m. every day and was on the dunes by 4:30 a.m. That gave him about 2 hours of darkness before the sun started driving temperatures up as high as 111 degrees. And he was running in that. So, what makes a 36-year-old British reality TV star attempt something like this? Well, he wanted to use the publicity to raise money for a charity called Make Some Noise. The charity helps people through bereavement. Spencer, you see, had lost his older brother when he was only 10 years old. The childhood trauma eventually led Spencer to become an alcoholic, something he's only recently overcome. He told one reporter, quote, "I replaced alcohol with the gym and running, and suddenly I became a different person. Mom started hugging me in a different way," unquote. As of recording, Spencer has raised over £500,000 for the charity and is continuing to bring more in. Best of all, the father of 3 isn't done. He said he would, quote, absolutely go for another world record, unquote. He's doing a lot of good, and I cannot wait to see what else he does. An incredible new gene therapy has literally restored sight to the blind. LCA1, or Leber congenital amaurosis type 1, is a rare genetic condition affecting the retinas, the part at the back of your eye that absorbs light and converts it into electrical signals that your brain can then understand. Babies born with this, their eyes don't convert enough of that into electrical signals for their brain to be able to use them. In effect, it's like being in a near pitch dark room, even on the brightest of days. Scientists at the University of Florida developed a gene therapy that uses a specially coded virus to deliver a properly functioning form of the defective gene to the retina's light-sensitive cells via a surgical injection. Only 15 subjects were enrolled in the initial phase 2 trials, but those receiving the strongest dose saw a 10,000-fold increase in light sensitivity. They said it was like someone finally turning the light on in a dark room. The individual accounts from these patients sound like something from movies. One reported seeing a star for the first time. Another talked about seeing snowflakes for the first time. And others were just excited to be able to navigate outside of their home or read the label on their children's candy for the first time. Again, this was just a phase 2 trial. For it to be widely available, it will need to be seen by the FDA, approved through a phase 3 clinical trial, which will no doubt be underway soon. A really interesting study here that you sent to us. This is from The Lancet, widely reputed, very trusted publication. The article's amazing title, as always: Meat Consumption and Incident Type 2 Diabetes, an individual participant federated meta-analysis of 1.97 million adults with 100,000 incident cases from 31 cohorts in 20 countries. So that's a ton of numbers. But the point is, this is a study associating meat consumption and type 2 diabetes, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, and it's a really big study.
It is.
Okay, take it away.
So let's start at the very end, and then we'll work back through some of the details.
I love that.
What they found, and don't get upset. We'll just talk about what they found, and then we'll unpack whether we feel that is a fair sort of assessment, and are there really practical takeaways from something like this?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what their interpretation was that the consumption of meat, particularly processed meat and unprocessed red meat, is a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes across populations.
Okay.
The findings highlight the importance of reducing meat consumption for public health and should inform dietary guidelines.
And you're quoting from the study.
Yes.
Okay.
Greater consumption of each of the 3 types of meat,
Which in this case were?
the processed meat, unprocessed red meat, and poultry.
Got it.
And their big thing was, a lot of these studies currently that exist, they look at red meat, processed meat, always under the spotlight. Well, what about poultry? We're always telling people to substitute with chicken, turkey, eggs, and such.
Yep. That'll
drive, better health outcomes. And their thought was, well, there's maybe the verdict is still out on that. Also, again, like you mentioned at the outset, this is such a large group of people. It highlights a little bit of a larger slew of the greater, world population. Not everybody, but bigger than just what we've seen historically, where it's either just a set of, Europe, Western Europe,
Yep.
or, United States or Canada and such.
Sure. Yeah.
So it does cover, in that
It's 20 different
yes,
countries.
in that respect, it does excel. But it certainly, falls short in other avenues also. So to take the interpretation one step further, looking at some of the numbers, they found, so they looked at everything in terms of hazard ratios, which we won't go into at this time, but they found essentially a 10% excess risk of type 2 diabetes when consuming 100 grams per day or more of unprocessed red meat.
Okay.
There was a 15% excess risk per 50 grams of processed meat. And then there was an 8% increased risk when consuming 100 grams a day or more of poultry. And so they found that there were positive associations with each of those groups. So later they do establish that if you were to substitute in some of their other analyses, if you were to substitute poultry, let's say for red meat or processed meat, that you decrease this risk of type 2 diabetes in doing so. But their big point is hey, see, all meat in this case bumps up your risk of type 2 diabetes. It's not just always this demonization of red meat and processed meat. See, it's potentially the other stuff too.
So we should all be vegan.
I mean, that's sort of like my...
That's what the headlines would lead you to believe.
Definitely. That's
Okay.
how that's kind of how this was presented. And sure, like that, it is what it is.
Right.
Right. It is what it is. But again, this is correlative data. There's only so much you can kind of control for in these settings. You can't control for every single confounding variable. They also noted that these risk percentages were decreased even further as you control for BMI.
Oh.
And so there's just a lot to be cautious of, because my initial thought was, as somebody who in general have over the last 5-7 years, I've decreased the amount of processed meat. I've decreased the amount of unprocessed red meat in my diet, and honestly, just meat consumption in general for a multitude of reasons. And so, full transparency, I went into this with the expectation that, like, yeah, this is going to further justify the way that I'm kind of bent in thinking.
Uh-huh.
And as I read it a little further, and as Peter Attia is another person who talked about this study in a thoughtful way, and just looked at what some of the other experts in this arena were saying. It did kind of open my eyes to some of the drawbacks that we mentioned, that this is not something that we can wholeheartedly hang our hat on and say that, see, this is why we're telling you to reduce the consumption of all these things. Again, it's just that we see red meat consumption, we see processed meat consumption, we see it in the context of colorectal cancer. Mm-hmm. We see it for other cancers. We hear it in terms of reducing, cardiovascular risk, and red meat is responsible for all these sort of things. It's just that you don't always hear about how it affects blood glucose and other metabolic diseases like that.
Yeah, because generally speaking, it's stop eating the sugar, and if you need to eat something, eat some meat instead.
Exactly.
Or a vegetable, but
yes. And so again, it was the authors of this study were very excited, and for good reason, that they pulled more of it's
a huge study.
Yeah, and they pulled a larger amount of people, and they also pulled in this aspect of poultry that just kind of automatically gets the free pass. And that's kind of, hey, what are we telling people, or what do we hear? It's kind of like a back of napkin rule. It's like, maybe it's a good idea to, instead of eating, ribeye every night, you mix in some chicken. And they wanted to say, well, hold on, let's look at this, in a larger picture. The one thing that I like to always mention with these observational nutritional studies are the ways by which they gather individuals' food, the actual food that they're consuming.
How did they get all of this data?
So, they use the questionnaires and the methods that they use. They are validated measures to figure out what somebody's consuming on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that they're just not inherently without issues. So in this paper, they looked at a single time point of their dietary pattern and just kind of assumed that that's the trajectory that they were on for the next 10 years, when they ultimately looked to see if there were any indications that they were type 2 diabetics.
Okay.
So they had to make sure that they weren't type 2 diabetics and had no signs of type 2 diabetes at the outset. And if they did, they were excluded. If they didn't, they left them in, and they followed them for 10 years. And then they used those, biometric markers and blood work and a whole host of other things to ensure that they were actually type 2.
Yep.
There's just inherent limitations by looking at a single snapshot of what somebody's dietary pattern is like.
Yeah.
You also miss things like what are they cooking their meat in? What sort of oils are they preparing this themselves? Are these all from restaurants? There's just so many factors. I mean, like you and I, if we're tracking our calories on one of these higher level apps, you can get a pretty good snapshot if you're regimented with how often you track. You can get a pretty good snapshot of your caloric intake over time, but it's always with a buffer of error.
Oh yeah.
And so there's just always kind of shaky ground here when looking at this research. But doesn't mean it's meaningless.
Right.
But it always just means there are you have to look at it in the greater context. Even though this is a huge meta-analysis, it's like, what is the context of the other research that's out there? Speaking of the other research that's out there, there was I believe it was like 2021 or 2022. There was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials looking at red meat consumption and diabetes risk.
Okay.
And essentially what they found is that when you look at it in like an interventional way, that people who have the dietary pattern that consists of greater amounts of red meat, that there really wasn't an increased risk in A1C and glucose monitor, or glucose readings and such for individuals on those types of dietary patterns. They even found in some cases that there was maybe a protective effect against these, issues with blood glucose.
Right. So a confounding study.
Yeah. And so you're like, well, holy heck. So you might look at that and say, well, see, you guys are full of crap. This is why I eat red meat. Well, I don't think that there's just no way you can walk away from any of these saying that like red meat is uniquely just so harmful and also potentially protective either.
Right.
In terms of type 2 diabetes. We're not talking about cancers and those other things that we mentioned. We're looking at it specifically in this context. You just kind of step outside of this for 1 minute. Things are not adding up. And so the takeaway, in my estimation, what I thought my takeaway was going to be when I read this is a bit different than what my actual takeaway is based upon all these factors.
Yeah.
And it's just that, like, look, if you have an issue ethically with red meat and meat production and environmental considerations and all of that, then I do feel that some of those are justified. I'm not a global warming expert, but I also can kind of see how the larger scope of how we eat at large affects things. Mm-hmm. So if you have issues in that respect, sure, let that maybe guide some of your decisions. But to take away from these couple studies that like we should just start attacking each other for the certain patterns of red meat consumption or whatever. I don't think that's the ticket either. But it's also, we also can't sit here and say that, yes, see, red meat and processed meat, especially, my goodness, and I don't think anyone's arguing this, but red meat especially, I don't really feel that it is a protective food to be eating in the end. You likely can do just fine without it. There are certainly benefits. There are certain vitamins, minerals, iron, some positives in consuming it. But I still feel like, and then if we take a step back further to say, if you look at like cancer societies and what their recommendations are for processed meat consumption and red meat consumption, I'm still leaning towards that to try and limit it to certain amounts. But again, I don't walk away from this with like a really hideously strong opinion. And that was another thing that really drove me to talk about this, is because, all you have to do is search this title in Twitter to see some comments that come up that are divisive. And I want to know who funded that study. I want to see the paper trail of that study. There's clearly some shady business going on.
Big vegetable paid for it.
Yeah. And I get it. I get how, actually I don't get it, but it is real. Like people have their identities tied to these discussions, and
we get tribal.
And so, yeah, if it triggers some people, that's good. But we're merely having a conversation, presenting what this particular study shows. But I don't think that I'm automatically assuming like nefarious intent on either side makes any sense.
Very cool. Well, let's go talk about it. All right. So clearly Dante is a big fan of this study. It's completely confirmed all of his biases, and he's done eating meat.
True.
As of today, it's done. Now, what are your thoughts about this? This is a big, interesting study. What's going on?
So, I mean, like I mentioned, I sort of went into this just assuming it was going to further validate just some of the changes that I've made personally. Not saying that that's 100% right for everybody, but after just understanding a little bit more of the specific methods of the study, and then also where this sits in the big picture of other systematic reviews, other interventional trials, it really doesn't change much at all for me at this stage. It's another example of just using some caution when a study this large in and of itself is fine, but then when the news outlets start publishing more clickbaity titles and it makes its way to Twitter and you know, those sort of interactions start to occur, it just muddies the water to overshadow the fact that this really doesn't change a whole heck of a lot right now.
It seems like the anger overshadows any good data that might actually be in there. That people's strong opinions make it hard to find the actual good stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be kind of the rule of the day these days. Joey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, first thing, I know Dante touched on it in previously, but correlation versus causation. I mean, there's causation is where the one variable, in this case, meat consumption, can be shown to directly influence and change the other variable, type 2 diabetes. This is a correlation. They're just showing that these two things move together, but it's not causal. So I think that's critical. But I think what correlation studies usually do for me in this case and in general, it's kind of a springboard to let's evaluate this. Let's get a study done. So it just depends on what if your framework is, I'm taking this study and making changes. Okay. Maybe that's not concrete, but fine, wherever you take from it. But to me, it's like, again, let's use this to get some more information and get a real randomized controlled trial.
Am I correct in thinking that in the correlation versus causation conversation, we don't even have causal proof that, for example, smoking causes lung cancer, that it's still corollary data? It's really, really, really not conclusive, but highly correlated, but that technically speaking, we can't prove that smoking causes lung cancer. Is that accurate?
I just think that it's so clear that if you're looking at lung cancer and you're looking at inhaling smoke, I think that's so clear. It's still a good, way to bring up the conversation though, because in this case, what can be associated with the meat consumption can be so many other factors. But just an example, especially when you look at maybe the processed, you're typically looking at quicker to make, easier to access, both financially and convenience wise. You're looking at that type of consumption, which potentially also may lead to all conveniences. You're eating maybe processed grains. You're not eating vegetables. There's a potential that there are variables that come together and confluence to create some of the results, the corollary results that we see. Versus the smoking, it's so clearly lung cancer. You're inhaling smoke. That's the difference. And I think this one is more wide open.
Absolutely.
The other kind of element that I gather from your point is just that ethically speaking, you can't randomize people to smoke. You can't just say, all right, as soon as these group of 16 or as soon as these people are 18 years old, we're going to take 1 million of them and force them to smoke for 10 years. And we're going to take another 1 million people and say no smoking. There are too many ethical limitations that simply don't allow you to design a study that would allow you to then confer causal relationships. But at the same time, there are mechanistic studies. There are large scale observational studies that continue to move it's a spectrum essentially of the link between two things. And if the strong majority of those observational studies, mechanistic studies that show the way different carcinogens accumulate in the lungs and do this and that, you essentially just use that mountain of evidence to say, you know what, we're pretty darn sure it does X or Y. But right, it's not like you can say we'll randomize we'll use blood pressure medication as an example. 1,000 people get it, 1,000 people get placebo. You can't structure smoking. You can't structure individuals eating necessarily for a lifetime. Say, this group, they're going to only eat red meat 3 times a week for the rest of their life. In this group, they're going to eat it, X amount of times per week. You can only look back at individuals' patterns, and then, you're limited in what you can draw from that.
Especially when you're looking for negative outcomes.
Yep.
Like we don't want to study that. So is that similar to what you had mentioned issues with the food data of collecting food data and the surveys that are used and all of that? Is what you're talking about with the ethics and the randomizing, is that the problem with food research, that you can't really know what somebody for certain ate?
That's a huge part of it as well. In this context, it would be just that when it comes to dietary reporting and measuring, most individuals, or even if we look at individuals in other studies reporting their levels of activity, we're just chronically underestimating in some circumstances, or you're chronically overestimating in some circumstances. It's like, depending on the cohort of people that you're looking at, you have a lot of people who think they walk way more than they do. But then when you strap accelerometers on them, they're getting 1,000 less steps per day. The same sort of sentiment applies when you're looking at nutritional, questionnaires. And so that's what is just inherent with studies like this. And especially in this instance, from my understanding, it was like a snapshot of time that they looked at their dietary intake.
Right.
And they didn't continue to check in on this over the course of the 10-year window.
And people's
basically.
diets do change.
They do.
Over time.
Mm-hmm. And so again, that comes back to, hey, you enrolled in this study, you got to make sure you don't change anything that you eat over, the course of essentially like a lifetime, basically.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do so.
That makes sense. Joey, other thoughts?
Along those lines with the amounts too. So the processed meat qualifier was 50 grams a day. That's 2 or 3 slices of bacon or 1 medium-sized sausage. So it doesn't take much to qualify there. And then I would be interested in moving forward. Okay, that's a certain amount that, to me, I don't eat those things daily, but if I do happen to have some bacon, that doesn't seem like a whole lot. And then what about, the 2 or 3 slices of bacon for breakfast, the burger for lunch, and then a steak for dinner? That's not that uncommon in certain people's diets. So what happens? Well, at the 50 level, 100 level, 150 gram, that's what I'd be interested to see too, if there's kind of a tipping point where maybe there's even more of an effect. Because I thought these, and again, this is not saying all these, the people who made this study did this wrong. I don't know what the number to pick is. I just think it would be very interesting to see it stratified as well. And then I think what's pretty clear to me too is linking it to type 2 diabetes. That's obviously a major disease, but I think what would be more, and it's difficult, but what would be more valuable is linking it to cardiovascular events like stroke and heart attack, cancer risk, those kind of things that, at least initially, I would associate more with meat intake, saturated fat intake in particular, and go from there.
But isn't that the point? Isn't that why they did this? Was because it's not the first instinct. It's not the first thought that you have.
Right. That was sort of my understanding too, that like, hey, I often hear about the drawbacks with red meat, or a diet rich in red meat or processed meat, in the context of colorectal cancers, or, it's largely more controversial in heart disease, especially when you think about saturated fats and cholesterol and all that sort of stuff. It's more controversial there, less controversial, less, the first instinct when you're thinking about blood glucose, I think definitely.
So what's the takeaway? What can people take away from this study? What is the useful data or suggestion that we can make out of this?
So on its face, I don't know from this specific study again that this is changing a lot. So I think that the takeaway is continue to evaluate your overall pattern. Because again, you're going to see a lot of people look at this or news articles jump on this, or depending on which side you fall on, people leverage these sorts of things to say, hey, why don't you think about how much meat you're eating? Well, I think that there are articles and there are compelling arguments on both sides that this does not ultimately add a whole lot. So the takeaway is to continue to look, is just kind of hang this up with the rest of the information that's out there with respect to how much meat that you're consuming in your diet. Because people on the pro red meat side, you can certainly incorporate a good portion of red meat in a health promoting dietary pattern.
Particularly
Absolutely.
unprocessed.
Exactly. The issue is, like Joey mentioned, just 50 grams a serving of processed meat, salami, pepperoni, the things that we love, bacon, sausage. I mean, those are, and now here we are, all these takeaways suddenly appearing, but that to me is what is the most eye-opening. And I don't think anybody's arguing that processed meats should largely be avoided. It's kind of like the smoking thing. Certainly they fit, you can fit them in, and there's just no way to avoid those in our day-to-day life. But on the vast majority of your meals that you have control over, your best bet is to avoid those sort of things. Maybe less of an extent with unprocessed red meat, if it fits kind of your other, ethical or whatever priorities that you have.
I think from a standpoint of what's interesting is, let's just say we get to the point where we have a randomized controlled trial and they can prove these associations. What is the mechanism? I don't know.
That's a good point.
I would be very curious to see what the mechanism is, because there's a part of me that sees this. And if I'm just kind of giving my initial thoughts, that it would be, well, there's a confluence of things. If you're eating a ton of meat, especially processed, you're probably overall not eating real great. And you have type 2 diabetes because along with the 2 steaks you eat a day and the burger and the bacon for breakfast, you are also eating a lot of candy. And you're also maybe drinking, and you're also eating a lot of processed grains, those kind of things. That's what I think will be the key. When you eliminate that, if this holds, I'd love to know how and start to parse that out.
Yeah. I mean, in their discussion, just directly what they have said, randomized control trials have investigated a mechanistic link between meat consumption interventions and risk markers for type 2 diabetes, such as A1C, postprandial insulin concentrations, and insulin resistance. However, no definitive effects have been reported. And that's common amongst some of the experts in the field that I, listen to. And so with that said, there is often some sort of mechanistic thing, some blood marker, something that happened in a petri dish, there's something that somebody clings to, and they say, hey, you know what? Like, there's something to this. We need to start looking at large scale stuff. Seems like that's a lot of times how these large scale studies come about. Is there's a compelling mechanistic thing that occurs first, and then you go look at the population and say, okay, do these things like point in the same direction? Whereas this is kind of the reverse, is that, oh, maybe there's this association, yet we can't pinpoint what that thing is happening mechanistically, physiologically, that's responsible for this. So unless it's certainly possible that there's something missing and unknown that we just don't know yet. Mm-hmm. But the greater likelihood in a game of probabilities is that unprocessed, let's say, just talk about unprocessed red meat, to be clear, that unprocessed red meat is neither helpful or particularly harmful in the context of type 2 diabetes, right? It's a reach to look at some of the more interventional and also mechanistic data to say, oh, you see, if only we would just eat more red meat, we would have less of these blood sugar issues. I don't think that's fair to, and also on the flip side to say, I told you shouldn't eat red meat. This is why we have all these people, there's a billion, the rates of diabetes are expected to increase by 2050 or whatever it is. So
So, I mean, I think if I understood you correctly, it's what you're saying is that it's kind of like if I just had a wild hair idea that, eating red meat causes toe fungus. You go, okay, that's maybe, but we don't have any real reason mechanistically to think that that's the case, but I guess we can study it and see.
Mm-hmm.
Lo and behold, there's a 15% greater rate of toe fungus around people who eat a lot of red meat.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because of the red meat, or is it just something else that is associated? That's interesting.
Yeah, that's what the randomized control trial would help you to understand. Then if you see there's true data there, then you start to, maybe it's an inflammatory marker or something, what
But the problem is
causing it.
we can't do a randomized control trial for diets. Can we?
It's very difficult.
Especially over a long period of time.
Extremely difficult. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with what could theoretically be again, there's just ethical considerations for people, whether it's a preference or what if this thing theoretically is harmful and we just subjected them to it for an extended period. But
fascinating. Well, that is it for us this week. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to check any of the sources that we mentioned, those are available down in the show description, either on the video or on the podcast description there. It should be available. All the links are in there. If you are not already on our mailing list, we would love for you to sign up. Go to our website. That website is www.askjoedimatteo.com. That's AskJoedimatteo.com. That site is also where you can find out about sales that we're having on all of the wonderful products that we sell, like Mag Essentials, as well as what else is there? Old episodes of this show. Oh, episodes of the show that started all this, the Ask Joe DiMatteo show, all there on our website. Go check it out. Thank you to the three of you. And that's it. Have a great week, guys. We will talk to you again soon.